Hello, pod smashers of the internet, and welcome to another episode of
Here there, beer, pod smash.
Where Gaming Goes to Grab a Beer.
You inspired me with your country song just before we started, so I figured
Nice.
I'd do a country twang to my...
We are your hosts.
Penguin and Termite, I am Penguin.
I am Termite, and we are a weekly video game podcast smashing together ideas that you care about, like water, with video games.
That's right, and that's what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about water in video games. It's a very summery topic. I was thinking about pools and beach and sprinklers and all kinds of watery things when I was writing up the notes for this episode, coming up with the idea. But we're going to be talking about water in video games. What does that mean? It means the notorious water levels and the appearance of water. It's a very prolific thing in video games, despite being such a simple thing in our lives. Has some huge design implications for video games, so we're going to talk about all of that. But before we do, we are where gaming goes to grab a beer, not a glass of water. So what are you drinking tonight?
I am drinking a repeat, but it has been a while, so maybe the audience doesn't remember this. But it's a limited release from Clown Shoes, which is a brewery. It is the double dry hopped Yeehaw New England
say that, and of course
style
I
IPA.
I'm not going to forget something like that.
Did you remember this?
I didn't remember the Clown Shoes part of it, but as soon as you said Yeehaw, I was like, okay, yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yep, and I read the can last time, and it's kind of a bit of a read. Do you want me to read it again?
No, just tell me about it.
Oh, it's double dry hopped IPA. It's pretty standard New England style, so it's a little hazy and full-bodied, lots of hops, sweet on the sides of your tongue, kind of back end, but not overpowering. It's not supposed to be sweet.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a really standard, run-of-the-mill, really good quality. Excuse me as I burp a little bit. I double IPA. Nope, it's not. It's just a double dry hopped IPA. So yeah, it's good.
Wait, is it double dry hopped or is it dry hopped double?
Double dry hopped. New England style
so
IPA.
It's the hops that are doubled.
Correct.
Okay. Because, right, you see I guess there is a difference there, right? Like if it was a dry hopped double IPA, that would be different from a double dry hopped IPA.
Because a double IPA would imply a Belgian style
right. That
beer. That's like in the style of an IPA, kind of fusion.
Yes, that is the thing that though I understand it, I will also be the first to admit it's super dumb.
Yeah.
Dumb terminology, but whatever. I also am drinking a repeat, but it is due to the fact that we are recording this the same within a few days of our last recording because of the way things shook out with your vacation and stuff like that. We had to do kind of a catch-up
I wish
episode.
It was a vacation.
Or, sorry, not vacation. Yeah, you're right. Sorry, work trip. Your absence
there you go.
had changed our schedule a bit, and so we had to double up this week. That's a little inside baseball, as you put it, but that doesn't really matter, other than the fact that it has affected my beer choice, and haven't been able to really get out of the house, so I'm just drinking another one of my Mama Tired, so I talked about that in the Housemark episode that we just
Blueberries.
we just had last week. Yep. Very tart blueberry sour ale. Though I just realized, this is crazy. I can't believe I had not been paying attention before.
Oh, all right.
They're like literally a block or so from the place I go donate plasma twice every week. There's a brewery I'd never heard of before.
What? What's it called?
It's called Final Gravity.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Well, what drew my eye is it's their logo has an astronaut on the front of it, and since
it does.
Since I just finished playing Returnal,
wait. So you've been giving plasma for how long? And you just now realized?
Just now realized there's a brewery right nearby.
There's a brewery right there, and you haven't provided anything to the show. You haven't gotten canned
And the only reason I even noticed it in the first place was because they have an astronaut, and because my brain is now hyper focused on identifying astronauts after playing Returnal. I was like, "What's that astronaut doing there? Oh, it's a brewery. Look at that!" So I need to pick up some beer. I'm hoping they have bottles or something. And
how far is it from your house?
Oh, it's 35 minutes, 40 minutes, depending on traffic. Yeah, it's not too far, but it's we'll hop down the road.
Oh, it's in Richmond.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. So I'm like, I totally could have grabbed some today. I'm kicking myself, but nope, just drinking my Mama Tired blueberry sours. It's delicious. Not complaining. But maybe next time I'll have some.
Speaking of Returnal, I did see my first astronaut appearance that was not the cockpit.
Oh, nice.
And I took
just
a screenshot
out in the wild. That's awesome. Yeah, I was so focused on gameplay that for most of the my runs through it that I was looking for it at some points, but I never saw it, even though I was told they're out in the wild.
Oh yeah,
that's awesome. Cool. Well, beer. That's enough about beer. What's going on? I had a little topic for banter that I was thinking about today, and that is
Ooh, lay it on me.
that is
Because I got nothing.
I'm a little jealous. Back when we were growing up, when we were kids, when we were our kids' age,
Back in my day.
right? I'm feeling a little bit like a back in my day grandparent right now because I don't have any fond memories whatsoever of any medicine that I had to take as a kid.
Yeah, me neither.
Never asked for it, never wanted it. It was always take this nasty, syrupy Pepto-Bismol, just awful tasting stuff.
Yeah.
So my kid's got a bit of a cold right now. It's the first one he's had in a long time because of all the, isolation we've been doing for COVID.
Yeah.
And he is like, every time we pass by the bathroom, he asks I want medicine, give me medicine. And I'm like, what? Are you kidding me? But like I've like I haven't tasted it, but I've like smelled it. You can smell. And and stuff's like loaded with sugar. The cough medicine we have for him like smells just like honey. I'm like, no wonder you want this. Like, this is just like sugar, liquid candy for you right now. And I'm like, man, we didn't have that as kids. I never asked for medicine. And how is my son going to have a healthy understanding of what medicine is supposed to be? It's not supposed to be good, taste good. It's supposed to be yucky. You're not supposed to want medicine because it's right. It's like chemicals and stuff, and you don't necessarily like you take it when you need it, but you don't want it outside of that. Now my kid's gonna be like, "Give me medicine" when he's perfectly healthy and fine. I'm like, how am
I feel like I have an aversion to grape flavored anything because of medicine. I hate grape popsicles, like grape Jolly Ranchers, like grape anything. I don't want it, and I think it's because of
when you taste something that's like super, artificial and sugary and almost chemically. What do you say? You say, oh, it tastes like medicine. It tastes like cough syrup. And it's supposed to be a bad thing. But no. My kid loves it. And maybe it's just my kid, but I have a sneaking suspicion that they've made this stuff taste better so the kids, it's more palatable for them. And I don't know how I feel about that. So I wonder what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I agree. We have 2 children that have regularly gone through medicine. And yeah, the children's Motrin is just like white sugar. Like it's just straight sugar. And I've tasted some of it a little just to see what's going on. And yeah, it's very, very appealing. If I had medicine like that when I was a kid, I would probably enjoy grape things.
You'd probably be addicted to drugs now. That's what I'm saying.
Like,
they're gonna be like, I have to keep getting that high. They're gonna be knocking back cough syrup when they're like elementary school kids and behind the bleachers at school, and it's gonna send them down a dark path. I'm being really hyperbolic right now. I don't think that's going to happen whatsoever. But yeah, that was the thought. The other thought, we'll probably get to some of this stuff in our news segments, but there's so much news flying around that we have to try to prioritize stuff. So I don't know what is or isn't going to end up in our news stories. But I found out today we're on the cusp of E3, and I found out today there's a there's a leak that is being corroborated from 2K that's being corroborated by some of the bigger names in the gaming industry. And it said that there's going to be a Borderlands spinoff announced at E3 that is going to feature Tiny Tina and to be called Tiny Tina's Wonderland or something like that. And I'm like, I would absolutely love a pre-sequel style spinoff, like a spinoff where it's like it's not one of the main entries of the Borderlands franchise, like not supposed to be like a main game, a side story, but has all the Borderlands gameplay. And allows you to play as like Tiny Tina, Brick, and maybe even bring back old Vault Hunters like Brick and Mordecai because they have clearly been together over the events of Borderlands 3. But like update their toolkits and update their talent trees to be more in line with Borderlands 3's gameplay, and then throw like Axton in there as a turret or something like that. Since
Assault on Dragon's Keep 2.
I would love that.
Done.
Oh my gosh, please! That would be amazing.
Yep. And
but like a full blown game, but designed with the Borderlands 3 engine, with all the new Borderlands 3 physics and stuff like that. Amazing. Like, but just like basically the I want like a similar like pre-sequel style game where it's like a side story, but it's not trying to be Borderlands 4. It's just its own side story. I want that.
Yeah,
that's what I want. I'm stoked about that.
This episode goes live June 14th, which is in the heart of E3.
Right.
And what you're talking about, Gearbox's presentation is with Ubisoft, and that would have happened 2 days ago on Saturday, June 12th.
Right. So we probably already know by the time this airs.
So we'll know by the time this happens. Yeah. Yep. And this is a great segue to quickly plug our news show, where you can keep up with our E3 shenanigans live on Monday evenings at 8 p.m. over at twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash, because you are going to get an outdated conversation here when it comes to news because we record them in advance. So this is a topic about water tonight, which is timeless. It'll always be a thing.
Always going to be water in
our
games.
very time-sensitive E3 announcements, news coverage, and live reactions and tweets you can find at 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our landing website where there are links to all of our podcast platforms and our social media outlets with which we will be providing our reactions and updates regarding E3. So follow our social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and we have a subreddit. We have a Discord server as well where you can jump in with our community and be hype with them. And then you can find a link at that website to our YouTube channel where all of our live streams from Twitch go for video on demand. And of course, go to twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash and subscribe to us there so you can be made aware of when we go live and talk about these things. And you can jump in and chat and correct us and heckle us and, hang out.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, community engagement's one of our favorite things, but
doing this podcast is our favorite thing. Favorite things.
Yes.
The segment of our show where we just talk about something that we're digging this week. And it can be deep and meaningful as swimming in an amazingly temperature body of water, or as shallow and meaningless as you ate some Doritos.
I was going to say, I thought you were going to go with the water idea and be like wading through a creek or something.
Oh, deep and shallow.
Deep and meaningful.
Puns.
Deep and meaningful is diving into, to the deep end of the pool from a high dive, or shallow as just wading through the local nearby creek. Anyways, so my favorite thing is my wife and I just finished a show on HBO Max called Raised by Wolves. And it's probably the weirdest thing I may have ever seen on TV. It's up there with Legion as which is a FX show, and it's up there with Legion as just weird, very, very strange. But it's made by Ridley Scott, the guy who did Alien. And it's definitely some pretty intense sci-fi, but the basic premise is that these two androids, so Earth is dying, and so these two androids have been sent to this planet. It circles it's in the Goldilocks zone, so it's a habitable planet, and they're basically these two androids, and then they've been sent with these human embryos, and they raise the embryos to, humans. They basically gestate and raise these baby humans as with an intention of building a new civilization. And that's the premise. So the premise is that. So these two androids basically raising these humans. And there's a lot more to it that I don't want to spoil. A lot of crazy things happen in the first episode. It's one of those shows where the majority of the plot happens in the first episode and the last episode. And then everything in the middle is character development, which isn't bad. It's just a lot slower.
Yep.
But man, we just watched the last episode and it was crazy. It was mind F. Mind blowing, crazy, stuff happening, and just very odd and strange sci-fi as well. But it's my favorite thing because it was really compelling. It's unlike anything I've ever seen on television before. So if you have an HBO Max subscription, I highly recommend Raised by Wolves, but go into it knowing that your mind is going to be messed with. And not in a bad way, just in a very, very it's mind-bending is the only way to describe it. So check it out. Raised by Wolves.
Raised by Wolves. All right. My favorite thing is issue number 3 of The Last Ronin. It is a comic book written by the creators of the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics, where they have picked up with a post-apocalyptic story that takes place in the future related to us, but also in the farthest future of the Ninja Turtles lore. And it is the 3rd issue in this book, and it is crazy, it is dark, and it is deep. It's fantastic. The original writers got together again after a giant fallout back in the 90s. They had written the first batches of comic books that the cartoons were based off of, but then had a fallout and have never worked together since until now. And so now they've written this new The Last Ronin, picking up where the Ninja Turtles comics have left off, and it's awesome. And they're really short. So there's 5 issues in this series that they're doing, and I'm already through the 3rd one, and they've been coming out. I think I have to wait another 3 months to get issue 4, so it's not out yet. And so it's fantastic. And I won't spoil anything because even the main character is a spoiler. So you don't know who the last turtle is. There's only one left. They're all dead except for one. And it's nuts. And you see the lineage of April O'Neil and Casey Jones and Hiroku Saki, which is Shredder, and Splinter, and because it's not even a generation removed from them, there are lots and lots of references back to the old days, and it's awesome. So if you are a comic book person at all, which I am not, so even if you're not a comic book person, go check out The Last Ronin. But the second kind of caveat to my favorite thing in this story is I went to the comic book store here in Fredericksburg called Gateway Comics, which is off Route 3, and I did not expect to find that they had a small collection of retro video games for sale as well. And I'd already been in the store several times, and I didn't see that they had games before, so I think it's a relatively new thing. And there was, in all of its glory, a complete in-box black label version of Resident Evil 2 on the original PlayStation for a significantly cheaper price than you can sell it on eBay. So I picked it up immediately because of the condition it was in, full, complete with a book, manual. The CDs are all in great shape, and the case is in great shape. So now I have the original PlayStation 1 version of Resident Evil 2, and it's not the DualShock version. It's the actual original. So I'm pumped. That's my favorite thing.
Awesome. Well, I would love to play it with you, the game.
Yes.
You said the game and the I would like to take a look at the comic next time I'm over there. So,
yeah, I've got 3 of them all in a row. You can just knock them all out. Just, they're pretty
You won't
short.
yell at me like in the comic book shop when they're like, "Hey,
no, they just yell at you because they want you to buy them. I don't want you to buy it from me. I want you to read it.
I know.
I will yell at you if you treat them like crap, though. You need to show respect and keep them in brand new condition.
Me?
So,
respect? Ha!
You don't chew on them.
Yeah,
you don't bend or fold or rip them. You don't draw on them, and you don't put stickers in them.
I really want to chew on them. Have you seen my shirts? Are you kidding me? For those who don't know, Penguin has a bit of an oral fixation. By that I mean
sounds hot,
right? I just for whatever reason it expresses itself as I chew on my shirt collars, and so if you ever see any wear and tear on my shirt collars in any of our live streams, that's why. I'm hoping that when I treat my ADHD, it might have an effect on that, but that's
it might
a complaint for another time.
Yep.
All right. Well, that is favorite things, which moves us to our next segment, which is DLC. Stands for downloadable content. It is a segment of our show where we have a fun mini discussion, some conversation you wouldn't normally have about video games. And tonight we're going to do a blank, but I've already picked the contest. So all I need from you is 2 characters, preferably ones that we haven't done before on the podcast, if you can think of them.
Ooh.
I will say I won't tell you what the contest is because I don't want to influence your choice, but it does have something to do with our main topic. So
interesting.
Water related.
I have no idea. I mean, we've been doing this podcast for almost 4 years, and I'm supposed to come up with a character we've never talked about on the show.
I have a list.
What?
I mean, I have a list of characters that we haven't talked about.
Are you serious?
For myself, yeah, because whenever I have to pick characters, I don't want to pick a character. Let's be real. We do tend to pick some of the same characters, so like.
Well, yeah, I
Mario
look at my wall of video
Snake.
games, and I'm just like cycling through them, and I'm like, which character have I not talked about in a while? And so I guess because it's the same library of games, even though it grows, if you give me a sec, I can stand up and go, get a character from something I know we've never talked about, if you would like. But give me a sec. BRB.
Sure.
Got it. I know we haven't talked about this character because I had to look in the instruction booklet to grab the name.
Okay.
So there you go.
Hopefully it's not too obscure, but
I don't think so.
Okay, go for it.
It is Surge from Chrono Cross, the sequel to Chrono Trigger. He's the main character.
All right, so that's one. You have another character to pick.
The other character, I do not have a second character. I should have done that.
Yes, you should.
I believe I have a character, and I need to just Google it really fast to make sure it's right. I'm not comfortable just saying it yet. Stand by. I believe this is who I think. Yes, Tanya from Mortal Kombat.
Great. Awesome. 2 new characters that we've never done before. Surge from Chrono Cross and Tanya are going...
Mortal Kombat 4 was when she made her debut.
Great. They're going to compete in a water balloon...
Oh, gosh.
...contest.
Okay.
So I don't know enough about Surge, and if our listeners don't, then remind me some details here.
I mean, he is the main protagonist of Chrono Cross, and he's a silent protagonist.
Oh,
but he sports an athletic build and dexterous finesse, having trained in the arts of his complex weapon extensively prior to the events of the game, covering his messy blue hair while his bandana is red embroidered with gold, floral pattern. His eyes are violet, although in some full motion videos they are depicted as amber. He was upturned nose and defined chin, very similar to those of his father Wazuki. He wears a baggy indigo-colored shorts with the pattern of a lighter blue running just above the hem. So he looks like he's from the beach. Like he looks like he's straight up out of the
I
beach.
can see it.
And,
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well, great. So we have two very specific martial artists competing in a water balloon fight. So I don't know. I feel like it's a toss-up right here. Tanya.
Tanya has a boomerang as her main weapon in Mortal Kombat 4. And I feel like, what is the water balloon con? You throw water balloons at each other?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like dodgeball.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, Chrono Cross involves time travel, but it's kind of like a fate-based environmental anomaly. It's not like Surge can travel through time. Otherwise, I would say he could just pause time and win.
Right. I'm gonna say Tanya has the edge only because she looks like someone who's gonna be a little bit better at dodging than Chrono. But it would be a close water balloon fight. Whoever ends up the wettest wins or loses. Whoever ends up the wettest loses. So I'm gonna say that Tanya just has the edge just a little bit because she looks lithe and acrobatic enough to dodge more water
Surge has a move called dash and slash, where he moves really quickly and slashes through his opponent like it's a super fast Smash Bros. Style Ike, for lack of a better description. Like, Ike's side dash slash thing that he does. It looks like that. And then he can partner with a teammate and do an X strike, making an X with two swords on their enemies. So I feel like because of that, he could probably inch out over Tanya's consistently more agile fitness build from fighting. Because he can, burst, do crazy stuff. Like, in that dash, he can dodge and throw more balloons.
Now, which one of them could fill balloons up faster, though? Because that's the other part of a water balloon fight. When looking at this, you obviously have to look at the character's strengths and weaknesses, but you also have to look at the nature of the contest and what it would entail. And running back and forth to fill up water balloons is probably the one of the most important parts. How many water balloons can you carry at any given time? So,
can you multitask to fill water balloons up while moving and throwing?
That is a question. Can you do that?
And I feel like Tanya would have the advantage because of martial arts in general and more dexterity with all of that.
Yeah, she's like chucking balloons with her feet while filling them up with her hands while dodging and doing cartwheels and stuff. Yep.
But Tanya's got some pretty crazy special moves. Like, she can lunge forward, spinning in a corkscrew manner with her flaming feet, which is kind of crazy. Almost like the X dash, but a little slower, but also vertically in the air. I'm sorry, she is horizontal in the air, which means she can dodge better.
Yeah, harder to hit.
It's just a straight line.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh man, she can shoot a blast of fire from her hand, like Liu Kang.
This isn't a fight. This is a water balloon fight.
Well, you can shoot the water balloons out of the air with fire, and avoid being wet altogether.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I'm gonna give Tanya. She's got the edge up on this one. I feel like Tanya.
Surge can do magic, like flying arrows and lightning and stuff. So it could just get insane.
That's gonna be
it might be evenly matched, but it would be
water balloon fight that you've ever seen. All right, well, we're gonna have to lean on the listeners for this one then. So who do you guys think would win in a water balloon fight? Not a fight, water balloon fight, where the goal is to be as not wet as possible as dry. That's the word for that. As dry as possible by the end of the fight. And yes, also factoring in the fact that you have to be able to fill up. You don't just have an infinite supply of water balloons already filled. You have to factor in the fact that they have to go fill up water balloons.
Yeah.
From a water source. So who would win? And Termite listed all the different places and all the different social medias and stuff like that you can interact with us. If you don't want to rewind though, quickly, Termite, what is the basics of where they can communicate with us if they have
just go to 80bitpodsmash.com and you'll find links to all of our social media platforms. You can click on any of those things: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit, and interact with us there.
Sweet. All right, well, that's DLC. Cool. All right, that's DLC. So now we can move on to our main topic and talk about water. There's a line in it was World of Warcraft Cataclysm in one of the dungeons. It was a whole underwater dungeon, which we may or may not end up talking about. But the end boss was you fought the spirit of water, but then you ended up defending him. It was a whole thing. He was on your side, so you ended up having to defend him from things that wanted to corrupt him. Mm-hmm. And when he finally charged up and and was ready to fight back, he had this whole line where he would go, "Feel the power of pure water." He would say it just like that. And for
What game is this?
It's World of Warcraft, and for whatever reason, that's like
Huh.
that gets stuck in my head. Whenever I talk about whenever I hear pure water or whatever, I go, "Feel the power of pure water."
I feel like I've heard that before. It sounds familiar.
Probably.
Yeah.
It was Cataclysm, the expansion, not
Yep.
Yeah.
Then
that's
I've
good stuff.
definitely heard that before. That
Yep.
sounds right.
So, anyways, so yeah, we're talking about water and in video games. So why don't we start with the first question? Everyone knows what water is, so we're not gonna, unless you're like some, alien from just a desert planet that has no H2O. You know what water is. We're not gonna spend or waste time talking about what it is. But we will talk about why is water such a design consideration in video games? Like why are we talking about this in relation to video games? And the sort of side question here is why is water such a challenge to implement? And we'll break that question down into some sub questions. But first, like, why is it a consideration in video games in the first place? Why waste your time dealing with water in the first place in video game?
You can add so much dynamics to a game just by providing an environment that's different, that has different properties applied to it. You can change the way it looks. You can change the way it feels. You can change mechanics itself. And we can jump into all of those different little categories there, but why not would be a better question.
Right, yeah. And furthermore, I mean, it's, again, when video games seek a certain amount of verisimilitude, which is, again, it's a big word, but it just means, like, truth to reality. And most of us, I would say, encounter water on a daily basis. Most of us live in areas where there is usually some kind of body of water nearby. Most of us have been to a body of water. So whether it's a river, a creek, a lake, an ocean,
or a pool,
or even just a pool, or even just running water in your house,
showers,
then
bathtubs.
exactly. Like we all encounter water on a daily basis. Now, granted, I will sort of caveat that statement by saying I totally understand that there are people across the world that don't have access to clean water or water in general, or drinkable water. So yeah, totally understand that is a reality for a lot of people as well. But I would say most people listening to this live in an affluent enough part of the world where they don't have to really think about that. So therefore, yeah, it's just something that we take for granted in our daily lives, but it would be weird to not have it when playing a video game, especially a game especially a game like Uncharted, that's trying to tell a story in the world. You kind of have to include water in that.
Yep.
So yep. But with that comes all kinds of considerations. You have to, the water has to look right. The water has to act like water does in real life. And then the water should, in some ways, affect gameplay. Sometimes that's as simple as water is like a trap, is a place where you can't go. It's a barrier. It's meant to form a boundary in the game for you. And so when you jump into it, you die and restart at the respawn point, or you just, in some games, you just can't. It's just a aesthetic barrier. When you try to go into it, there's an invisible wall that prevents you from jumping into the river or whatever, and it's usually just there to, be part of the level design to guide you there. But we're not talking about that. We're not talking about that gameplay implementation of it. And in this episode, we want to talk primarily about the gameplay implementations that include the ability to be in the water on some level or another. But so as a result of those considerations, water tends to be fairly challenging to implement. It's actually one of the I remember listening to a CG artist one time say that water and fire are the hardest things to graphically render. And so let's start there. Let's talk about why is water hard to implement in games, a challenge to implement from just an aesthetic purpose.
Yeah, I mean, it is, at least in modern 3D games, water is computationally expensive. Thermodynamics are at play. There's like levels of computational complexity that we don't even have in the physics world to actually simulate stuff like oil and water and like real world stuff. Way much less in a video game where it's kind of inconsequential, but you have to fake it. So it's astronomically expensive on CPU power to predict and render actual water properties. And so that's why it's a challenge from a developer perspective, because you can't do it the way, quote unquote, it would need to be done, like hair or physics of grass or like, how
Wind,
something animation
yeah.
moves through an environment. Like, they can actually use real-time physics and apply weight to things. You cannot do any of that with water
Yeah, we
in
talked
any
about
real meaningful way.
Yeah, we talked about the physical, or graphical implementations of gravity in our episode about gravity and fall damage.
Yep.
Way easier to program than water itself, because water has
just less expensive on the
Yeah.
processor. It's
Right.
like regular physics, like simulating a race car moving with the velocity and acceleration with momentum and weight behind it with inertia and such. Like, all those equations are
It's mathematically simple.
easier.
Yeah, easier. Now, maybe not simple, but the complexity is the literal mathematical complexity is less. But water
Right.
has so. I mean, that you're exactly right about that. It has so many properties, and fluids in general are way more complicated to predict on a mathematical scale how they're going to move. Therefore, trying to program that is
It's impossible.
like you said, it's impossible. We can only
now.
ever simulate it in a way that makes sense. Furthermore, water interacts with light in particular ways, and so getting the lighting right is really challenging, and it's getting better and better and starting to look better and better. But the best renditions of water I've ever seen have always been very carefully curated. It's in the background. It's not something that you're interacting with, because every time you do, once you get up close, you start to peel behind the curtain and see that, like, oh yeah, no, that doesn't look like the way like you put your character's hand through the water. You'll quickly notice that doesn't look like the way water. It usually just clips right through your hand. It's not. It doesn't go cascade around your hand the way that water would in that circumstance. So yeah, those two reasons.
That's a great segue to just talk about breaking down how water is designed in video games. There's three kind of big categories that I've come up with.
Sure.
There's the visuals, there's like the physics behind it, and then there's gameplay mechanics. And starting from like least impactful to the most impactful to the player. So the least impactful to the player is just the visuals, because usually that doesn't involve anything related directly to physics or mechanics. It's just how it's visually displayed. And this goes all the way back to like the 90s and 80s on the NES.
Yeah.
These apply. And you can break that down into three subcategories. And I got this information from, I always like to cite my sources. Digital Foundry is a YouTube channel, and John Linneman is one who works with Digital Foundry. And there's a great video that's like 3 years old that's all about water in video games. And so I kind of got this from him. That's the source material, and then I kind of put my own spin on it. So he breaks it down into three. So this is within just the visuals. There's the aesthetics. Then there's the wave patterns. Wave patterns are like the actual geometry behind like moving as a wave crashes on a shore. It's just like triangles, polygons. And then there's underwater rendering. And so like the aesthetics and the visuals are things like reflections and animations.
And color. What color? I mean, like,
yes.
Go to anybody or take a picture with your phone, I guess, or camera. Go to 4 different bodies of water just near you, and I guarantee you, if you were to hold those pictures up side by side, the color would look different on each of those bodies of water, because water is, despite what we are led to believe growing up, water is not always just the nice ocean blue that the crayon is. You know what I mean? Like, water takes on all kinds of properties depending on what is in it and what is around it, and just
it's
from a
both
color standpoint,
see-through and reflective.
Yeah,
so everything about the environment that you're looking at from the outside and what it's sitting on and what you're looking at through, it all affects the color and the hue of water.
Right,
so, yeah,
and that has to be simulated on some level from the light. We're gonna have a whole episode on lighting at some point. We'll talk about technologies like ray tracing and stuff like that, but again, this comes into from just where all that interacts with water. Like that's lighting and the way it reflects and both goes through, allows you to, is translucent when it interacts with water, is mind-boggling. I can't even imagine trying to solve that problem from a visual artist standpoint.
It's cool to like think about the side-scrolling early implementations of water, like in the original Mega Man from NES, and how all it was like the background changed to a different color of blue, and there was a horizontal like pattern of sprites that would switch between like some waves to simulate some bumps. And then like, because the gameplay mechanics would change, you would know you were underwater. Otherwise, visually, you just kind of passed through a barrier and now you're in a background that's different.
And we filled in our, obviously the human imagination is very powerful tool when it comes to the suspension of disbelief as it relates to water in video games. And my 7-year-old brain seeing water, they're Hylian River in Zelda for the first time, I'm like, wow, it's totally water. Whereas like now I'm an adult and I look at it and I'm like, oh man, that's embarrassing. But at the time, it's like, wow, it's water, it's beautiful, it's so real. Whereas it's just kind of fun that you like, bringing up Mega Man, you're like, we've gone from that where it's literally just a different color blue with like wavy pattern sprites in the background, and then we have like The Last of Us Part 2 where it's they actually like simulate. It was a curated moment, but they actually simulated like ocean currents, and when you're swimming just a small part of the ocean trying to get to a place. And like you literally feel like you're going to get swept out to sea in that moment because it's rendered so beautifully and well. That it's cool. We've come a long way with the visuals of it.
It's even something as simple as, I want to bring up Donkey Kong Country, the original one for Super Nintendo. Like there's an underwater level that kind of applies an entire wave across the entire screen. It wasn't just the blue background, it was actually a visual effect that they did on the front, like a layered like texture changing warping kind of thing that made you realize you were underwater, as if you had been underwater and you opened your eyes. It's just like everything seems kind of blurry.
Oh, that's awesome.
Shifting around, and then like some really early reflective I don't know if you are familiar with Mode 7 for Super Nintendo games, but it was a way to do like parallax. It's like layered textures that like each 5 to 10 pixel rows would shift. It would be one image, but they would kind of shift left and right on each other. And there's an NES game that was shown off in the Digital Foundry video that I've never seen before, but it was a nighttime cityscape. And in the background, there was just like right in the middle of the screen, there was a row of these parallaxed textures, sprites, that would update that kind of simulated a reflection. And of course it's drawn, very granular. There's no like reflection rendering happening whatsoever. It's a Nintendo game. So it's just like yellow buildings in the background and yellow reflections that are distorted on water, but it looked really, really cool. And it had zero effect on the gameplay. It was just like a background thing. It was just like, it kind of moved. The best example I can think of that's mainstream would be like how Sonic the Hedgehog 3 on the Sega Genesis did the water background of Angel Island on the very first level when you're flying in on the plane, the intro sequence, and you can see the water in the background. Like they did that kind of stuff with reflections, and it was all just purely visual. It had no impact on anything, and that's really cool.
Right.
And then you talk about like The Last of Us and how it affected and how it reacted to the environment. A very, very early model of that would be like Wave Race 64, which was a jet ski racing game. And so that was wave patterns that was actually interactive, but they used polygons to just render like you would a mountain or like a car. It's just like very, very intentional. It's not any simulated stuff. Kind of like now we have like fluid dynamics and such. So we've come a long way, and it's really, really cool. So I do want to talk about physics and buoyancy.
I do. I just have one final note on aesthetics, and I would say another very common way for that. We talked a little bit about underwater rendering. That was one of the components, where it's like you have to both sell the water like surface. Like if you're looking at so depending on the video game, sometimes you have to do both. But for the most part, you're either selling what it looks like to look at the water surface, whether it's wavy or placid. But then sometimes you also have to what does it look like to be underwater, depending on the game. I would say that one of the most common ways to sell underwater environments is to have bubbles. You're underwater because look, there's bubbles, whether they're bubbles coming out of your character or bubbles just coming out of fissures in the ground or whatever. The bubbles are another huge way to visually sort of represent underwater stuff, because
you can also change the sound. You can make it like
yep.
What?
Cool. All right, so physics though. So the other design challenge to implement is you have to, or you don't have to, but a designer has to. Well, right, a designer has to weigh how much they want the water to be true from a physical standpoint, or to affect things from a physical standpoint. And though that is also a factor when it comes to the visuals, because there are physics at play to represent water visually. What happens when the character jumps in? How does it interact with the character, or how does it interact with the camera, or whatever? That is a whole different, separate design implementation and challenge. So what do we have to think about from a physics standpoint?
I like timelines. So I'm gonna start with like early NES games. Your jumping mechanics in a platformer would just feel more floaty or more heavy. One of the two are different ways to implement. You're in a body of liquid. You could simulate like tar, and where things are really sluggish and thick, or you could do water where it's like you could jump higher because you have buoyancy. You can float a little more. And I know there's like the Super Mario Brothers, like the very first NES game that like mattered. The water levels in there, your entire way of moving was entirely different because you would have to tap the B button, or maybe it's the A button, the jump button, to like swim up, and you couldn't move forward unless you were in a pattern where you're tapping A and then move forward. Like you couldn't just walk, and if you did, it was ridiculously slow. And so how you navigated enemies and how you navigated through the level was entirely different than in the air, where you could just run and jump freely. And then like migrating that through the Super Nintendo with Donkey Kong Country, going back to that, and how everything felt different. Again, you were side scrolling and swimming through water. It was not as floaty as it was in the original Mario. But then you go all the way to how it affects Wave Race in the N64, where you're on top of the water and you're floating on it and you're bouncing off waves, like they're ramps, and you're getting air and water effects. You can flip off, you can wreck just by hitting a wave the incorrect way. You can use physics to like jump into the water and then back out. And then Half-Life 2, I can't even imagine. I can't talk about water without mentioning Half-Life 2, because that was mind-blowing. When that game first came out, buoyancy was a very new technology with real-time physics rendering, and there was an entire puzzle around taking barrels filled with air, and you have to grab them with the gravity gun and pull them underwater and release them underneath of a platform to make the platform float so that you could drive over it with the like boat thing. And I was blown away by doing that because it was all real time, and that's a way of rendering and doing physics in water. And then of course you have like the most modern games like The Last of Us Part 2, where you're struggling to swim and it's cascading over the character and it affects everything.
Right. And you have even games like Returnal, where you got another aspect of water, and we kind of talked about this in our weather episode, is you got water sometimes that falls from the sky. It's rain. And so with Returnal, they would actually like simulate the raindrops off through the haptic feedback on the DualSense controller, which is a cool sort of implementation of an aspect of water. Kind of, it's not exactly like raindrops, but it's close enough closer than I've ever seen. The other thing, when you're talking about physics and water design specifically, like one of the things when we talked about we talked a little bit about physics in our gravity episode, and how just sort of a basic physical property is that you always have, I believe we even said you always have the ground beneath your feet. And that's actually wrong, because in video games that have water levels or water portions or whatever, then suddenly that aspect of the physics can change. And even though there still may be an up and down, because there's, even underwater, there's still gravity, your range of motion can change, and it's not just you have a what is it called? Is it an x-axis? You suddenly have an x-axis as well as a y-axis to deal with, and that can it can completely change how you control the character in that space. And so many games do this, and that can kind of change. I mean, it's a different kind of physics, but it's like, yep, you are now in a different environment, so there's a whole different range of motion that you can now include, and some games do and some games don't. But it is a consideration. Like, what are we going to do when this character jumps in the water, and how do we design levels with that in mind? And furthermore, how do we? Is like every game answers the question of what do we do with the control schema? Because we spent so much time talking about or designing the game with the ground beneath the character's feet. What happens when there's no ground anymore? In most cases, there's a slight change in controls that the player then has to adjust to when they're underwater. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely and that's kind of inching into gameplay mechanics, but it's gameplay mechanic change because of the change in the physical properties of the water.
A good example of what you're talking about is like Mario 64,
mm-hmm.
when you could just swim in any direction at any point.
Mm-hmm.
Like once you're in, there's that one level 3. I think it's called Jolly Roger Bay. There's a giant ship underwater like you have to swim down to it. And I remember like being disoriented because I was trying to swim through this tiny little window, and like you go inside of it and it's all water and you can swim anywhere. There's even a secret 8 coin collecting area space right outside of Jolly Roger Bay. You can jump up into one of the little cubby holes and you find a secret space that's entirely water, and it's actually a race against the clock. We'll get to mechanics in a minute because you can't breathe underwater. But yeah, it was totally that exact twist in gravity because there was no actual down other than what's rendered. You don't really sink. And so, yeah, that's interesting to have that almost like weightlessness space mentality when it comes to being underwater.
Sure. And even I mean, I one of the thoughts that comes to mind is like World of Warcraft, where you jump into the water and then you suddenly have like the X axis to move with as well. So you could like literally like hold down the right button on your mouse, the right click on your mouse, and then adjust the angle at which you're looking, which would then change the way your character moved. And they ended up taking that same, so like they already had implemented that for when you're underwater in the game. And so when it came to include flying mounts, when they were eventually going to include flying mounts, they just took that same like water design and applied it to the air. You can move along the same axes in the air as you can underwater, but you can't move along those axes underground or on the ground. Sorry.
Yeah.
So it was interesting, but cool. So we've been beating around the bush. We're talking about gameplay mechanic, or so the kind of next design consideration is gameplay mechanics. And we'll also use that to segue into our next question because oftentimes the gameplay mechanics are where water levels start to become irritating for players. So the next question that we'll talk about gameplay mechanics and why it's a challenge to implement, like what considerations are challenging when it comes to implementing water in video games from a gameplay standpoint. We'll also talk about why players hate water levels so much. Why is it so hard to get? Why is it so hard to get water right from a gameplay perspective? What's challenging about it? So some of the gameplay mechanics that obviously come to mind is like you were hinting at. You can't breathe underwater. So if you're shooting for any kind of sense of verisimilitude, you have to consider, like you have to implement, or you have to consider implementing an oxygen system or not, some kind of oxygen system where it's like you have only a limited amount of time to be underwater before you have to go up for air. And so some games are just like, no, you can just breathe forever underwater. It's fine. Because we don't want this is not that kind of game. But a surprising number of games, I would say, include a breath mechanic. That can be just so irritating sometimes.
Yeah, it's a good way for like a developer or a game designer to build tension. It's like, here's this section, you don't have anywhere to go. You have to keep swimming or you're going to die. And so it just like builds this tense with the player. It's like, oh crap, I have to get through this.
Right.
Kind of situation. And just adds another layer of challenge to whatever you're trying to get through. I specifically think of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle game for the NES, the original one, where you have to swim under a dam and deactivate these bombs. And while you can breathe forever, the platforming is a nightmare. It's not really platforming. It's just swimming. The physics that they use to swim through, it's an absolute nightmare. It's very difficult to dodge the insane amount of obstacles they place in front of you. And it's very difficult. And I'm sure a lot of controllers were broken in that level. And then Sonic the Hedgehog does have an oxygen system. And sometimes you'll fall so deep into a part of a level that you will struggle to like platform your way out to get air, and you'll just die. And you just get so stressed out because it has this like ridiculous sound and music that plays like bop, 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 and it gets faster and faster, and it's like blah,
you just humming that spiked my stress levels up just a little bit.
So those are some of the water gameplay mechanics that from a gameplay design perspective, you're doing things to affect the psyche of a player, but you can also use it to tell a meaningful, impactful like story beat as well if you want to. Like Tomb Raider, when you're going underwater through underwater segments, you know you can't breathe. It's like, just keep swimming. Oh my gosh, how long are you going to last? I know Uncharted plays with that as well. So. Yeah,
and so there's a couple of thoughts here with the gameplay as well. So there's, water and breath can be used as a gating mechanic where it's like, sort of a Metroidvania style gating mechanic where it's like, sometimes the character will even say, I can't go there because I can't breathe that long underwater, and it's meant to hint to you, come back later when you have an item that'll allow you to breathe underwater. I think of like the rebreather. There's a rebreather you get in Tomb Raider, and then you get a similar thing in like Ratchet and Clank as well, where it's like, oh yeah, you can come back later and solve that puzzle when you get the item that lets you. But so it can be used as a gating mechanic. It can also be used for puzzles. It can be used as a puzzle solving thing where like, I think of Zelda does it all. There's almost always a water level in Zelda games, and they're almost always water-based physics puzzles. You need to fill up this section with water, or you need to drain the water from this section. Blah 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 blah. And so water can be used to you have to divert water or drain water and blah 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 blah. And all those can be used in gameplay. So. And then you also mentioned platform and control implications, like dealing with the controls of swimming is not always elegant. Usually the buoyancy changes the way you can jump. Usually water levels have low visibility. I'm looking at you, Returnal, and there's also can be sections of the water level where it's like they clearly don't want you to go there. So if you go there, you die. You can't just swim indefinitely down or up or whatever. So sometimes there's just weird pitfalls, like literal pits in water levels, that sometimes are used as challenges for you to accomplish. Sometimes they're just used as boundaries, but they're not always, whereas sometimes it's like, oh, I can avoid that cliff in a land-based level. It's not always that easy it's not always that easy in water levels because the controls and the physics are so different. So all of those are reasons that contribute to why players hate water levels, but they're also all the core gameplay mechanics of water levels. like everything that makes water interesting from a gameplay perspective is also, we each could probably pick an example of how it was awful in like a video game that implemented it. So why do you think that is? Why do you think it's so, like, why are the quote water levels, almost universally reviled in video games?
They're almost always more difficult. For some reason, there's just a difficulty spike.
Right, that's 100% correct.
And so I guess it just adds to the frustration, especially if the rest of the game, like, it's one thing for a game to be made to be difficult, and that's like Soulsborne, Returnal, like other roguelites.
Yeah,
like, they're meant to be difficult, and they're designed that way. It's a whole other conversation to have when you have a game that is only difficult because of bad programming in water levels, and you're just dying.
Looking at you, Water Temple.
Yes, and it gets so frustrating because the rest of the game sets the precedent and the context, and you have this one spot or these repeating spots that are water-filled that are just nightmarish, and it's like this massive difficulty spike, and it's frustrating, and it doesn't fit with the game. It's very it's annoying.
Yeah, and I've also noticed that water levels tend to, usually the water affects, usually the up and the difficulty due to the change, usually, because sometimes it's not inherently more difficult, it's just because it's such a drastic change. Usually that change in difficulty often translates into combat. So if the game has any kind of combat, that combat usually can be more difficult in water levels. What I've seen, though, is sometimes developers, I think, know that, so they intentionally tone down the intensity of water levels in order to compensate for that. Which can then end up resulting in the water levels are just boring or dull. I think of, like, again, notoriously the Water Temple. I remember that temple just being excruciatingly boring because not only were the puzzles obnoxious because of the water, and in that game you had to equip your iron boots, you had to actually go into the pause menu and equip them, as opposed to like having them in your quick slots on your buttons or whatever. So you had to put your iron boots on to go underwater over and over again, and then take them off and put them on.
And that was so annoying to constantly go in and out of your inventory.
Right, but so on top of all of that, it was also just like there wasn't a lot of fights. There wasn't a lot of interesting things to do. There weren't a lot of cool enemies. It was just it was the other than the Shadow Link fight, which again doesn't take place underwater. It's like you're sitting in like ankle deep water. You're standing in ankle deep water. It's
actually really cool. Yeah,
it's a really cool fight. It's the only cool fight in the entire dungeon. Everything else, even the boss fight of that one, is just boring and kind of stupid. I hate the Morpho fight. So,
and that was the hook shot to like pull the little eyeballs off.
Yeah,
and that was annoying.
So right, exactly. Yep. So it's it's just sometimes again, one or the other. It's either it makes the combat more difficult and more hair raising than it may already be, or they intentionally tone down the combat encounters, which then just makes it boring on top of the tedium of dealing with the water already. Yep. So, cool. Well, so with that in mind, what are some of the most notoriously bad water levels, other than, of course, when everyone started this episode, the immediate thing that came to mind was the water temple, and that was intentional. The water temple is probably universally, the water temple from Ocarina of Time is probably universally considered the worst water level and probably the worst Zelda level in any Zelda game, and maybe any game in general, because of many of the reasons we mentioned above. But what are some other bad ones?
The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle level that I just referred to earlier is one of the notorious in-game world. Like, the industry knows that that's a terrible water level. Then there's...
I feel like the water levels in Mario are pretty bad in general.
In general, they are, yeah. Through Mario 1 especially. Yeah, we have that. There's a really bad water level in Conker's Bad Fur Day. It's a maze of underwater darkness where you have to manage oxygen, your headlamp's battery life, and it's dark, and there's these robotic fish that swim around. So it's just nightmarish and ridiculous. Like, why would you do that? The Kingdom Hearts 2 has an underwater section with the Little Mermaid, and it is maddening. It's not done well at all. It's so bad. Everything about the game has changed, how it's played, impractical controls. It's horrible. And I didn't realize that until I was replaying it on the PlayStation 4 through the HD remake. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so bad. It's just hard to control. It's everywhere. And that's usually what happens. So those are the ones that I can think of that are kind of well known. There's some like more niche ones.
I mean, there's a ton. I mean, everyone's probably got examples of their own too, because there's a ton that are bad. I roll my eyes when I get to a water level, and then am pleasantly surprised if it doesn't turn out to be that bad. Yeah. But it's just like so many developers sort of insist on there being a water level. Like, it just seems to be one of those things where it's like, oh, we got. I mean, it's because it's a relative. I understand why it's a relatively unique biome. Not unique, but it's a relatively, it's both a different, for all the reasons we talked about. It's a different from a design perspective. They have all these cool considerations and cool things. They want you to appreciate the craftsmanship of the water that they put into the water. And yet at the same time, I feel like most gamers are just like, oh, freaking water level. You know what I mean? Yep. And I think that's, but at the same time, it's something that's not going away because, again, there's verisimilitude to it. There's interesting. It's different. They can use a different color palette. Like, there's a whole bunch of motivations from a design perspective to include water or water level, a level that prominently features water. And yet it just seems to be one of those things that the industry has such a hard time getting right, but it does sometimes get it right. So that's our next question. What are games that handle water design well? And I think that a couple things. I think the water design in Breath of the Wild is like appropriately challenged. It's appropriately challenging. It's not meant to be something that's super easy, but it's not challenging because it's obnoxious. It's challenging because it comes with its own challenges. But one of the great beasts was a water beast. It was the elephant or whatever. And I thought, I remember it was the first one I did, and I remember being like, this is not bad. I don't mind this. Like, I don't hate this. And then I also I'd be remiss. I've got a coworker who would literally stab me if we talked about water in video games and didn't talk about Subnautica.
Oh, and yeah. I think that, you were playing that the other night.
Yeah. I mean, so Subnautica is a survival game by its nature, and so it's similar to what I just talked about with Breath of the Wild, where it's like it has all of those obnoxious considerations with water, where you have breath and you have to deal with the sort of the physics of going underwater and stuff like that. But that's the whole crux of the game, and so it's designed with that in mind. And so I think that I guess it was more tolerable in that regard. But the whole point is like the progress of that game is tied to your ability to deal with the water. So you can, you unlock schematics and blueprints for things like, little like bigger oxygen for everything from a bigger oxygen tank to a vehicle that allows you to go through the water faster. So the whole progress of the game is tied to dealing with the water, and the entire. So there's like very little, if any, like land-based parts of the game. It's all underwater. The whole entire game is an underwater game. So you don't have that change in controls. Like, once you get used to the controls, you're not going to have to deal with many changes to them. So I think that it negates some of those problems with water design by making those problems the entire game, as opposed to you're playing a different game when you go to the water level, right, as is the problem with a lot of games.
Which I imagine, I didn't really get into it too much, but Echo the Dolphin, it's like an entire water-based game where the whole game is that.
Right, and Maneater too, for that matter.
Oh, yeah. I haven't played that yet either.
Yeah.
I like how they do water, and like I played Far Cry 3 and I platinumed it actually, and it did water fine. Like, you just jump in and you can swim around, and there's
Right.
sharks, and like you can get on boats and float around, and it's fine. Like it wasn't stupid.
Right.
I like some of the older games, like Mega Man X had some awesome water levels and water-based boss fights because you could breathe underwater, but it changed the physics enough to make it kind of more fun. It just changed the game enough. It didn't like add obscenely difficult stuff for no reason. And I talked about Donkey Kong Country several times, but their water levels were always fun and soothing, and the music's great, and the atmosphere looks good. There's bubbles, and there's all kind of fun little like visual effects. And I looked up some of the best water levels online, and I didn't notice this until I read it, but Super Mario Odyssey's Seaside Kingdom was awesome. It's a straight-on beach. It's the notorious picture of Mario's nipples, like yeah, that made its rounds when it was first showed off. But that whole level was super fun to explore and navigate with the water, and like never seemed to like Mario Sunshine is maddening,
right,
in its water physics.
Yep.
And Mario Odyssey did it right, and so that's
I
don't want to give
I
a
don't
shout out to.
I don't recall the water level in Odyssey being bad, therefore it probably was fine.
Yeah,
that's actually kind of a decent point. Is like, if I don't notice it being awful, then it probably works. You know what I mean?
Yep.
They talk about that in theater with lighting design, where they're like, lighting is one of those things where it's like, you're not meant to notice it. And if you're not noticing it, if it's just having it's a proper effect on the story, that means it's working.
Yep.
And I think that is kind of true with water design. And like, if you're not sitting there being like, what the heck, this is awful, then it's probably good water design.
Yep.
Yep. So we are going to probably have to end there because I didn't realize we're having such a good conversation. I didn't realize that we were this far into the episode. But
look at that. Yeah,
I think it's a good stopping point. And the last two questions were kind of filler questions anyway. So I think we talked about everything I wanted to talk about. So that is water in video games. And we want to hear your thoughts. What water levels do you hate and despise? What water levels do you love? What are some design considerations of water in video games that we may have missed, that we may not have highlighted? We would love to hear those thoughts and more. So Termite will once again summarize where the best places are for you to find us if you want to have those conversations with us.
If you stuck with us this long, this will be the third time you've heard it, but go to 80bitpodsmash.com. It's our landing website with links to all of our podcast platforms of your choice, as well as our social media outlets. Don't forget, there's a Discord server link in all of our show notes, and we have a twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash account where you can find us live every Monday and Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Monday for our news show, and Wednesday for our live gameplay live streams. I think I said the word live too many times, but
fine.
Check us out over at twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash. And if you missed those videos live, you can check them out on demand at YouTube, and you can find the link there also at 80bitpodsmash.com.
Awesome. So next week is going to be the Monday before my birthday. So I picked this topic with much aplomb. We're bringing back, just for at least one episode, we're bringing back the video game lit series. So I'll be pulling from that template for the question. And so we did episodes on theme, plot, and character, which are very important when analyzing things from a literary perspective. But the one thing that we didn't talk about is setting and the impact that setting has on story. And so we will be talking all about setting, how setting impacts video game storytelling, aka our video game lit series, and that will be on June 21st, it'll be episode 196. So check it out then.
Perfect. With that, we will see you next week. Bye.